Athens. 399 BC, the world's first democracy puts its wisest citizen on trial. His crime, asking questions. Meet Socrates! Stonecutter turned philosophy's ugliest sin. Dirt, poor, and armed only with relentless wise. He never wrote a word, but inspired Plato and drank poison for free speech. This isn't ancient history. It's a warning for every cancel culture warrior. Socrates is one of those historical figures whose legend has grown bigger than his bones. Trouble is, his bones are missing too, because the great philosopher was tried and convicted by the democratic government he helped create. We have next to no record of what he actually said. Everything we know about him comes secondhand from people who picked up his ideas and ran with them. Most notably, his devoted student, Plato. So this story will be a little messy, a bit contradictory. It's gonna take us to some crazy places. And at the end of it, you might just find yourself asking, who really knows anything? And if that sounds like a challenge, well, that's exactly how our story starts. Part 1. Stonecutter with a superpower. Fun fact, Socrates looked like a troll. Bulging eyes, flat nose, hairy back. Students called him the satyr. But don't get it twisted. While he dressed in rags and smelled like stale sweat, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Quote, "The only true wisdom is knowing you know nothing." Pro tip. If your parents are a sculptor and a stonemason, chances are you won't end up on the other side of the chisel. But that's exactly where we find our boy Socrates, chipping away at Athenian statues while dreaming of something more. We don't know much about his youth, but according to Plato, Socrates was driven by a mysterious daemonion, an inner voice that warned him of mistakes. As a young soldier, he got into hot water for disobeying orders, apparently because his daimyo told him to disobey. At 40, something clicked. All those politicians pretending to be experts, all those so-called wise men, they were all frauds. But how could he expose them? He had no political clout, no money, no land. What he did have was his mind and his mouth. What he did have was his mind and his mouth. And with them, he developed a superpower. Through casual conversation, he challenged people to define concepts they couldn't. What is bravery? What is justice? What is beauty? Their failure to answer revealed their hypocrisy. Soon, people paid Socrates to sharpen their logic before they went and made fools of themselves. He became famous. He became influential. And as far as women were concerned, well, let's just say his looks didn't help. Part 2. Human lie detector. Now, call me old-fashioned, but there's something deeply satisfying about a good lie detector test. After all, it's human nature to mistrust strangers, and strangers smell fear. When you breathe fast. When you're lying, your eyes dart around. Voila, busted. Too bad it takes years to perfect these skills. But luckily for Athenians, Socrates didn't need technology. He had something better. A keen intellect and endless patience. His weapon! The Socratic method. Step 1. Ask a simple question. What's virtue? Step 2. Dissect contradictions. You say virtue is doing good, but isn't helping your enemy also good? Step 3. Watch your victim implode. Socrates had a bullseye radar for hypocrisy. He would corner poets and ask them to explain their verses. They stammered, changed the subject, sometimes threw punches. He'd turn to the rich elites and demand to know how being wealthy proved their superiority. Those Athenians quickly shut down. That's why he was so popular. With the masseuse, though, the brainy elite hated him. He dragged them into philosophical boot camp, exposed their flawed reasoning. Then, ta-da, stood right there, smiling like a loon. Over time, his popularity turned to infamy. And let's face it, Socrates wasn't making friends along the way. Part 3. Trial of the Millennium. Fun fact, at Socrates' trial, he roasted the jury for being too dumb to recognize wisdom. Quote, "I am not an Athenian or a Greek, but a citizen of the world." Now, Socrates' downfall started when the mighty Delian League Athens' band of rebel-stomping allies went rogue. In 413 BC, they sent home the 400 Spartans and traitors. What followed was the most devastating war in Greece's history, which ended in Athenian defeat. And if you're looking for someone to blame, you can't do much better than the guy who spent his whole career exposing Athenian flaws. Here's the thing. Socrates wasn't a politician, but when the 30 tyrants took over, his students sure were. Any chance of saving the democracy was on their shoulders. But how could they fix things if they couldn't even define them? Remember, Socrates was a soldier, not a statesman. All he knew was asking questions. And hey, maybe that was enough. According to Plato, when the new leaders demanded Socrates be arrested, he asked, "Is that what the law says?" When they lied and said yes, he said, "Well, then the law is unjust." Case closed, right? Wrong! The tyrants accused Socrates of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. The latter charge stemmed from his habit of saying, "I know that I know nothing," to the Athenians. That sounded pretty disrespectful. Plus, he was a pain in the backside. So while he had tons of fans, he also had plenty of enemies. At trial, prosecutors demanded death. And guess what? Socrates suggested Athens pay him like an Olympic champion. Now, maybe that was hubris, or maybe it was brilliant strategy. Or maybe, just maybe, he was testing his students. The jury voted 280 to 221. Guilty. His final offer, exile. Nah, he'd rather die. That's why Socrates stayed and drank poison. Part 4. The poison heard round the world. Fun fact. Hemlock poisoning causes gradual paralysis. Socrates joked about owing a rooster to Asclepius, the god of medicine, as he died. Quote, "To fear death is to pretend to be wise when you are not." Socrates didn't go quietly, but he didn't go kicking and screaming either. See? Death wasn't a surprise. He'd been sentenced months earlier. He had time to prepare. And unlike so many of his students, he wasn't afraid. After all, he'd studied death long and hard. What scared him was giving up his quest for wisdom. Imagine that. The greatest fear of the wisest man who ever lived was letting go of questions. On the fateful day, his devoted students gathered around him, wept as he prepared for his final lesson. Then, calm as you please, he drank the cup of poison. As he began to feel the numbness creep up his arms, he signaled to a servant to go to the oracle and claim his prize. He knew he'd die soon, but not before telling one last joke. When a fly landed on his nose, and he flicked it away, he asked his disciples, "Do you think this fly would have buzzed around my head if it hadn't been deaf?" "Of course not," they replied. "So," said Socrates, "it seems the oracle was right. I am singing sweetly now, doesn't it?" Just before losing consciousness, he smiled and whispered, "We can't be certain about anything except death. But one thing I do know, there's an unexplored region of life after death, and I intend to explore it. And that's why he's still relevant today. Because here's the thing, Socrates didn't write any books. Everything we know about him comes secondhand from Plato's Xenophon, and even the comedic playwright Aristophanes, who mercilessly roasted him in one play for being an ignorant old fart. But despite the laughs, Socrates gets the last word. If he were alive today, he'd be tweeting 280-character hot takes and starting hashtag cancel culture wars. He'd be calling out billionaires and politicians, grilling them until they admitted how much they didn't know. Sure, he might look ridiculous with his bug eyes and beer belly, but beneath that ugly exterior beats the heart of a warrior. And that's why he matters. Because no matter who you are, no matter what you believe, the world will always reward smart people who aren't afraid to admit they don't know everything. Outro quote, be as you wish to seem. Socrates is the original free speech martyr, the OG cancel culture warrior. So, remember his 3 lessons? 1. Don't care what people think. Be fearless in the face of persecution. 2. Question everything. Only fools pretend to have all the answers. 3. No one's as stupid as you think. Even Socrates couldn't define justice. So keep learning and keep questioning. Who knows? Maybe you'll start your own trend. And in the meantime, Have a Socratic life. Challenge conventions. Expose injustice. And whenever someone claims to know it all, just smile and say, "Hey, look at this bug on your head." That's all for this episode. Thank you for watching.